In this video, we're looking at stacked bar graphs. So the bar graphs that we're familiar with are typically, for example, drawn this way, side by side, if it's a horizontal one, or vertically like that, side by side, if you're representing data across different categories. But a stacked bar graph means the bar graphs are actually piled on top of one another. And in this case, because we're looking at a percentage, and we know that percentage figures add up to 100%, it then makes sense for us to put it all as a stacked bar graph rather than have it separate. So in this case, the stacked bar graph refers to the proportion of tourists that various regions in the world received in 2000. So that means that, for example, how many percent of the total number of tourists in the world visited the Middle East, how many percent visited Latin America, so on and so forth. In this case, what we need to pay attention to is this, the name of the region. We also need to pay attention to this, the scale. So the name of the region actually tallies with the color here. Just nice is laid out corresponding to the region above. So Middle East is this color, Latin America is this color, so on and so forth. For the scale, we look at this. 20% is divided into 5 parts, which means this is 0, 4, 8, 12, 16, and 20%. So this is how we read it in intervals of 4%. Now let's look at the figures for each region. Middle East first. So Middle East, the lower bar is at 0% here. So let me label it at 0. This bar here, the higher bar, the higher end of the bar, is at about 3%. So we can say that 3 minus 0, Middle East represents 3% of all the tourists visiting different regions in the world. Then let's look at Latin America. This is about 7. So 7 minus 3 gives me 4%. Let's look at others. This is about 17%. So 17 minus 7 would give me 10%. So that's what we can do across all these regions here. We can calculate the percentage figures. So let's continue. North America. This is about 44%. 44 minus 17, that gives me 27%. It's all math here. Here, we get about 79, I believe. So 79 minus 44, that gives me 35. And finally, we get 100% here. So 100 minus 79, that gives me 21%. Now, even without calculating the percentage figures, you would realize that North America here forms the biggest bar, which tells you straight away, visually, North America takes in the most highest percentage of tourists amongst all regions. And since Middle East has the lowest or the smallest bar, you would then know that the Middle East takes in the least proportion of tourists. Of course, to support your answer, that's where I need to bring the figures in. So you need to tell me things like, the most is North America, how many percent are we talking about? The least is the Middle East, how many percent we're talking about? Beyond that, you can talk about the second lowest or the second highest here in North America. Sorry, 35% is for Europe. Europe is the highest, followed by North America. Let's look at the second graph here. So in this case, the stacked bar graph is not about percentage, it is about actual numbers here. And then from the actual numbers, they calculated the percentage for you. So this stacked bar graph shows you the projected growth in tourism worldwide from 2015 to 2030. So 2015 is what has passed, 2030 is the projection. And this is about outbound tourism. Outbound tourism means that, for example, this blue part here is about Europe. So how many people exit from Europe? How many Europeans visit places outside of Europe, outbound? Similarly, how many Asian Pacific people visit areas outside of Asia Pacific? So these are all the numbers here. And in this case, because the data is trying to show you multiple things, it is helpful that they actually gave you the numbers. So for example, 2015 here, 594. Again, how do you calculate it if you had to? 0, this is 594. That's how they got 594 here. And from 594, they calculated up here. So the range of this gives you 290. So on and so forth. So again, with stacked bar graphs, you can see straight off the comparison. Europe has the highest number of outbound tourism compared to the rest. Not only can you see numbers in this graph, you can also see the proportion of it. So 594 converts to 51% of all tourists that toured in 2015. From there, you go on to 2030. And again, you see that the percentage figures are rather similar. So again, you get Europe, that's the highest percentage in proportion. But you realize that even then, the percentage actually dropped. 51%, it dropped to 46. Never mind, it's still the highest proportion, but the percentage number dropped. In terms of number, it did increase. So that's another point that you can bring up. And then we look at Asia. Asia, the number increased as well. And the proportion also increased, but it's still not the highest proportion in the entire world. You can do similar comparisons for the Americas, Africa, and the Middle East. Another thing that you can point out in this graph is this. Overall, projected growth in tourism worldwide increased from this number, basically 1 billion, 1.1 billion, to 1.8 billion. Overall, there's an increase. And then you can look at specific numbers of certain regions and specific percentages as well. So this graph here is very, very rich. Let's go on to this here. What does all these mean? So you see other kinds of percentage figures here, and these percentages differ from the percentage shown on the graph itself. Within the graph, these percentages are about the proportion of each year. So in 2030, Europe forms 46%. In 2015, Europe forms 51%. But if we look at here, the percentage of projected growth just means that between 2015 and 2030, the number of tourists, the number of outbound tourists increased by 40%. How do I get 40% here? I take 832 minus 594, use 594 as the base, Europe increased by 40%. Similarly, Asia Pacific, I take 541 minus 290, use 290 as the base, and realize that Asia Pacific grew by 87%. Another point that you might want to highlight is this. Even though Africa and the Middle East, in terms of proportion, it didn't increase a lot from 2015 to 2030. The proportion-wise, 3% to 4%, 3% to 5%, not much of a difference. But you realize this, in terms of numbers, they grew the most. Because probably they have a very small base, that's why when they start growing, the projected growth seems like a lot. So when it comes to data like this that gives you all different kinds of information, make sure that you take time to break down the information one by one. And it's helpful for you to look at the question as well, to figure out, do you really need all sorts of information, or are they looking about a specific part of the graph only? So this graph, the more complex a graph is, the more room for the graph to test you on distractors. So distractors means data that distracts you from what the question asks you. So pay attention to keywords in the question to figure out what to write.